The wind screamed across the desolate plains, a banshee keening over a land already bled dry by winter. Snow, fine and sharp as glass dust, scourged the frozen earth, piling in unforgiving drifts against the skeletal remains of fences and abandoned wagons. Alara stumbled, her tattered cloak offering scant protection against the biting cold that seemed to seep directly into her bones. She was alone, utterly and terribly alone. The last vestiges of warmth and hope leached out of her existence days ago. The small bundle clutched against her chest held little more than rags and a few crumbs. The meager supplies she'd carried had long since been consumed or lost to the relentless elements. Her feet were numb, her face raw and chapped, but it was the cold knot of despair in her gut that threatened to freeze her from the inside out. They had driven her out, the righteous folk of that small, unforgiving town, their faces twisted with condemnation and fear. The whispers had turned to shouts, the suspicion to certainty in their narrow minds. A woman alone, with nothing but her resilience and the ghost of a past they couldn't comprehend, was a threat, an anomaly to be purged. She had fled into this, the vast, indifferent wilderness, hoping for. She no longer knew what she had hoped for. Survival felt like a cruel mockery of deliverance. Her breath hitched, a shallow, painful gasp. Ahead, barely visible through the swirling snow, was a low, dark shape against the white expanse. Not a rock. It had a definite structure, a chimney sending a thin plume of smoke into the indifferent sky. A cabin, a dwelling, fear-ward with a desperate, primal need for warmth and shelter. Who would be out here so far from anywhere? A trapper? A recluse? Or something worse? Her past had taught her that people were often more dangerous than the wilderness itself. But the alternative was certain death, a slow, agonizing freeze beneath the uncaring snow. With a final surge of will she hadn't known she possessed, she pushed forward, each step a monumental effort, the wind snatching at her, trying to drag her down into the white oblivion. The cabin loomed larger, a rough-hewn structure of logs, solid and defiant against the storm. There was no welcoming light in the small, grimy window, just the smoke, a promise of heat that seemed impossibly distant. She reached the door, a heavy plank affair barred from the inside. Her strength gave out. She slumped against it, raising a trembling hand to knock, the sound swallowed instantly by the wind's roar. She knocked again, a little louder, a fragile plea against the tempest. Silence from within. Then, a heavy bolt scraped open. The door creaked inwards, revealing not a face, but a looming shadow in the dim interior. A man stood there, massive and still. The air within was thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and something else, something wild and untamed. He didn't speak. He simply stood, blocking the entrance, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of a fire. She couldn't see his features, only sense his presence, imposing and unreadable. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "Please," she managed, her voice a hoarse whisper, barely audible above the wind. "I need shelter." The silence stretched, taut and heavy. She braced herself for rejection, for the door to slam shut, leaving her to face the storm's fury alone. But then, slowly, he stepped back. The space was small, begrudging. An invitation, perhaps, or merely an acknowledgement of her presence before deciding her fate. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second, then stumbled across the threshold, the door closing behind her with a solid thud that cut off the wind's shriek, but seemed to amplify the silence within the cabin. The air inside was thick with the warmth of a small, crackling fire in a stone hearth. It was a crude shelter, one room, sparsely furnished with a rough table, a stool, and a narrow bunk covered in furs. Everything was functional, bare, speaking of a life lived on the harsh edge of existence. The man turned fully towards her, and she could see him now in the firelight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face etched with lines carved by weather and time. A thick, unkempt beard covered the lower half. His eyes, dark and steady, regarded her without expression. They held no malice, but no welcome either, just a quiet, assessing gaze that made her feel utterly exposed. He wore buckskins and thick wool, blending almost seamlessly with the rough surroundings. He was the wilderness-made man. Cain. She knew his name, whispered in fearful tones in the town she had fled. The hermit, the wild man who lived beyond the pale, rumored to be dangerous, perhaps even touched by the devil. Seeing him now, she understood why the stories persisted. He radiated a quiet, self-contained power, like a coiled spring. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask why she was alone, half frozen, stumbling out of the blizzard. He simply watched her, his silence more unnerving than any interrogation. She sank to the floor near the fire, holding out her numb hands to the flames. The heat was a painful shock at first, then a deep, aching relief that spread through her limbs. She didn't dare speak again, sensing that his silence was not an invitation for chatter. Her mind, still reeling from the cold and fear, began to process her predicament. She was trapped here, with a man she knew nothing about, based on reputation alone. A reputation steeped in fear and isolation. But she was alive. For now, she risked a glance at him. He had moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire with deliberate, unhurried movements. There was a competence about him, a stark capability that was both intimidating and, she had to admit, a little reassuring. This was a man who knew how to survive out here. Her own survival now rested entirely upon his silent, unknown terms. She thought of the town, the angry faces, the cold judgment that had been far sharper than the wind. Here, there was no judgment, only the raw fact of her presence, accepted with a kind of indifferent pragmatism. It was a strange kind of refuge. She watched him prepare something simple to eat, dried meat and hardtack, offering her a portion without a word. She ate slowly, her stomach churning with a mixture of hunger and apprehension. The food was plain but sustaining. As she ate, her gaze drifted around the small cabin. A rifle hung on the wall. A few traps lay in a corner. Pelts were stacked neatly. This was his world, spare and solitary. She was an unwelcome intrusion, a disruption to his quiet order. Yet he hadn't turned her away. Why? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Was it simple human decency, buried beneath layers of solitude? Or something else? She couldn't read him. He was as unyielding and mysterious as the wilderness that surrounded them. The wind howled outside, a constant reminder of the peril she had escaped, and the precariousness of the shelter she had found. Sleep felt impossible, her body exhausted but her mind racing, hyper-aware of the man sharing the small space with her. She huddled closer to the fire, listening to the sounds of the storm and the quiet, measured movements of the man named Cain. Days blurred into a week, marked only by the cycle of the storm outside and the dwindling pile of firewood within. The cabin became her world, and Cain its silent, watchful sovereign. They existed in a state of enforced proximity, a quiet accord born of necessity. Dialogue remained sparse, functional. More would water, snow shows no sign of breaking. His voice was low, gravelly, used to long periods of disuse. Her own replies were hesitant, brief. She learned his routines. The precise way he stoked the fire, the hours he spent mending gear, the quiet, intense focus he brought to every task. He was a man of actions, not words. He never pried, never asked about her past, the past that felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. This absence of interrogation was a strange balm, a stark contrast to the relentless questioning, the veiled accusations she had faced before. She began to relax infinitesimally. The fear didn't entirely vanish, but it shifted, becoming less a terror of the man himself and more a general wariness of her situation, of the unpredictable nature of life itself. She started to help, tentatively at first, gathering kindling inside, sweeping the dirt floor with a bundle of twigs, melting snow for water. He accepted her help with the same quiet lack of comment he accepted her presence. It wasn't gratitude or even acknowledgement, just a practical acceptance that these tasks needed doing, and another pair of hands made them easier. In these shared, silent labors, A fragile thread of understanding began to weave itself between them. She watched him patch a tear in his coat, his large hands surprisingly deft with needle and thread. She saw the care he took of his rifle, cleaning it with meticulous attention. These were not the actions of a brutish monster, but of a man living by his wits and skills in an unforgiving world. She started to see the quiet strength beneath the stoicism, the deep reservoir of self-reliance. One evening, as the fire cast flickering shadows, she found herself speaking, the words tumbling out softly, hesitantly. Not the whole story, not the worst of it, but fragments. The loss, the blame, the journey. He listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the flames. He offered no sympathy, no judgment. When she finished, the silence returned, but it felt different now, less empty, more like a shared space. He finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. This land, it don't care about blame. Only if you stand or fall. It wasn't advice, just an observation, stark and true. It resonated deep within her. The wilderness didn't care about the injustices she had suffered, the cruelty of human hearts. It only demanded strength, resilience. It demanded that she stand. In that moment, something shifted within her. She was not just a victim of circumstance, buffeted by forces beyond her control. She was a survivor. The storm outside seemed to lessen, its fury perhaps spent. But the world beyond the cabin remained a threat. She knew she couldn't stay here forever, a burden on this solitary man. But leaving meant facing the unknown, and the possibility that those who had driven her out might still seek her. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, colder than any wind. Just as the weather began to grudgingly ease its hold, revealing a landscape of glittering snowdrifts under a pale sun, trouble found its way to the cabin. Two men, rough-looking and hardened by the trail, arrived one afternoon, their horses snorting in the cold air. They were trackers, hired by someone back in the town she had fled. She saw the recognition in their eyes, the cruel glint that promised retribution and perhaps something far worse. Her heart leaped into her throat, the old fear seizing her with paralyzing intensity. They dismounted, approaching the cabin with an air of predatory confidence, their hands hovering near the pistols on their hips. Cain stepped out onto the small porch, blocking their path, his presence suddenly larger, more formidable. He didn't speak, just stood there, a silent challenge. "We're looking for the woman," the taller one sneered, his eyes flicking towards the doorway where Alara stood frozen. "Heard she ran this way. There's a reward for her return." Cain's dark eyes remained steady. "She ain't here." His voice was low, flat, leaving no room for argument. But the trackers were not men easily deterred. They had the scent of their quarry, the promise of coin. "Don't lie to us, old man," the other one growled, taking a step forward. "We know she's hidin' with you. The whole town knows you taken strays." The accusation hung in the air, linking Cain to her in a way that tightened her gut. He was risking himself for her. Why? Cain didn't answer with words. His hand moved, too fast for her to follow, drawing the rifle that had been leaning against the doorframe. The movement was fluid, practiced, deadly. The rifle was raised, aimed squarely at the chest of the lead tracker. "Get out," Cain said, the quiet menace in his voice far more terrifying than a shout. The trackers exchanged uneasy glances. They were two against one, but they were facing Cain, the man of rumor, the man who lived by himself in this harsh land. They saw the cold resolve in his eyes, the certainty in the way he held the rifle. They saw that he was ready to kill them. Slowly, reluctantly, they backed away. "This ain't over," the first one spat, mounting his horse. "We'll be back, and next time we'll have more men. You can't hide her forever." They rode away, swallowed by the vastness of the landscape, leaving behind a silence that vibrated with tension. Alara stumbled outside, her legs weak. You didn't have to do that," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. He lowered the rifle, his gaze sweeping the horizon where the trackers had disappeared. "Yes, I did," he replied simply, turning to look at her. There was no explanation, no expectation of gratitude. It was just a statement of fact. In that moment, facing the threat, seeing his willingness to stand between her and danger, the last remnants of her fear of him dissolved. He hadn't just given her shelter. He had given her protection, a defense against the cruelty of the world she had fled. She looked at him, seeing past the gruff exterior, past the rumors, to the quiet strength and unexpected compassion of a man who chose to live apart but possessed a deeper sense of honor than those who had cast her out. The encounter with the trackers, though resolved swiftly by Kane's quiet threat, left an indelible mark. It was a stark reminder that the world outside was still hostile, that the past she had tried to outrun was tenacious. But it also solidified the unspoken bond that had grown between Alara and Kane in the isolation of the cabin. He had chosen to stand with her, against men who represented the very forces she had fled. That act was a foundation, solid ground in a life that had felt like shifting sand. The storm finally broke, giving way to crisp, cold days and starlit nights. The vastness outside no longer seemed purely menacing, but also awe-inspiring. Alara no longer saw herself as merely a fugitive, a victim hiding away. She saw herself as a survivor, tested and not found wanting. The resilience that had been a desperate flicker was now a steady flame. She helped Kane with tasks outside the cabin, chopping wood, checking trap lines with him. She learned to move differently, to observe the land with a keen eye, mirroring his quiet watchfulness. He taught her simple things: how to gauge the weather, how to identify tracks, how to handle the rifle with a steady hand. He didn't treat her like a helpless woman, but like a capable individual capable of learning and contributing. This quiet respect was a balm to her bruised spirit. It was in the shared silence of these tasks, the rhythm of their movements working in tandem, that their connection deepened. There was no need for elaborate confessions or declarations. It was in the shared glance after a difficult task completed, the quiet understanding when one offered a hand without being asked, the comfort of his steady presence beside her. Her internal monologue, once filled with fear and despair, began to make room for determination, for a quiet sense of purpose. She was still carrying the weight of her past, but it no longer threatened to crush her. She was learning to stand, just as Kane had said. The threat of the trackers lingered, a promise of future danger. But facing it no longer felt like an impossible burden she had to bear alone. There was a quiet strength in their shared vigilance. She had arrived at his door a broken, terrified soul, stripped of everything. She remained vulnerable. The scars of her past ran deep, but she was no longer lost. She had found a refuge not just from the storm or her pursuers, but within herself, mirrored and supported by the steadfast presence of the solitary man who had opened his door. The future was uncertain, perhaps still dangerous, but for the first time in a long time, she looked towards it not with dread, but with a quiet, resilient hope. They were two solitary figures, forged by hardship, finding strength and solace in an unlikely partnership against the vast indifference of the land and the occasional cruelty of men. The journey of rebirth had begun in the heart of the storm, in the quiet refuge of a hermit's cabin, and it would continue, one determined step at a time, across the wild, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape.